Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Happy Friday, everyone. This is Marty Kaiser with Real Estate Tidbits. This is our latest episode. Hope everyone's doing well. Today, we're going to have a little twist on things. We're going to talk about what I think are very important topics, and hopefully they're going to enlighten folks and have conversation between yourself and your business associates, friends, family, etc. So we're going to go into a couple categories today. Obviously, we're going to discuss real estate. I'm going to have some interesting data. We're going to correlate the effects of our country's economic and political policies. How do they impact real estate? And then we're also going to digress a little bit into what actually is going on with our country and discuss some historical parallels. The first thing I wanted to go over, which I thought was quite interesting, was some real estate data that I did during my research. And this is from the NAR, which is the National Association of Realtors. And they're kind of the governing body of real estate agents and brokers throughout the United States. So here's some of the data that you may find interesting. The group of what we refer to as baby boomers, which are defined as ages 60 to 78, out of all the groups, they're the least concerned or affected by housing challenges than other age groups. Believe it or not, even though they're advanced in age, they are the largest share of home buyers. 42% of home buyers presently are baby boomers, and 53% are sellers. So over half the sellers presently are baby boomers, and these are national statistics. What are the reasons why these folks are so active in the real estate market? Well, they have a desire to be close to friends, family, relatives. A lot of them are retiring and they're downsizing. About half of the boomers, or 50%, are purchasing with cash. And you find that a lot in our over 55 communities, that a high preponderance of the purchasers pay cash. This is in large measure due to the tremendous growth in housing prices, as these baby boomers that are selling their homes are getting significant equity and profitability from their homes due to the appreciation that we've had over the past 10 years or so. And the reason why they're benefiting the most from the appreciation is that they have owned their homes for longer. So the average baby boomer that is selling now has owned their home between 13 and 16 years. So they've maximized the most recent appreciation wave that we've had. Other statistics that you'll find interesting are Generation Xers, which are ages 45 to 59, have the highest household income of any generation. They would be considered in their peak earning years, which is historically correct. So obviously the baby boomers, a lot of them are not working anymore, and they're generating a lot of their income from retirement income. So the Generation Xers have the highest incomes of any generation. The older millennials, ages 35 to 45, are not too far behind the Generation Xers. So I thought you'd find that interesting. Now, some of the reasons why do customers want to work with real estate agents and brokers? Well, according to recent statistics, again through the NAR, buyers of all age groups said their top reasons for working with a real estate agent were to get assistance finding the right home to purchase, negotiating the terms of the sale and price, completing all paperwork, and expecting the agent to keep the transaction on track and problem solve where necessary. In my own personal experience, I find all these things to be very true. I think the most subtle things probably are two things: negotiation, strategy, and skill, and probably equally or more importantly, are keeping the transaction on track, because you have peaks and valleys. Some deals have a lot more challenges, And it's up to a good agent to be proactive, trying to anticipate challenges, trying to minimize challenges, trying to make the experience for his or her customer as pleasant as we can. And in conclusion, basically problem solving, taking care of the problems where they occur, and ultimately going to a successful closing for all people that are involved. Now, sellers, on the other hand, expect their agent to properly provide information and price their homes competitively, to market their homes in a diverse way to potential buyers, to sell their home hopefully within a specific time frame, to pinpoint ways to fix up their homes to sell for more, and effectively coordinate and do all the scheduling. And you're finding, along with that, a lot of people are hoping to simultaneously sell and buy. For example, in order to fund their next purchase, they have to sell. So one of the things that I find, not only to try to put my customer at ease, but that's one of my greatest challenges, is trying to coordinate. How do you efficiently coordinate when a house closes and when a buyer buys? And at times you're doing what we call simultaneous closings. So it's a very sensitive topic and it's somewhat stressful. But the more of these that we successfully navigate, the more satisfied customers we're going to have, obviously, and the more customers that are going to successfully able to navigate that landscape. So one of the things that's come out in these various studies are people do more preliminary research on the internet through a lot of the data sources that you can find, but the percentage of people that work with real estate agents and brokers has not declined whatsoever for a lot of the reasons that I elaborated. And then there's other reasons too. But nonetheless, people that use real estate agents and brokers for the most part fare much more successfully and put the burden and stress on their realtor's shoulders, and they can focus on their day-to-day lives, their jobs, their family, their recreational activity, etc. So I thought those things were very interesting, and it's things for everybody that listens to keep a note about. So yesterday, some of you may have seen a social media post that I placed leading up to today's podcast. And the headline of my post was Grifters or Idealists. And the reason that I posted that, I wanted people that read my social media posts to think about those terms a little bit, because they're going to be a big part of what we talk about today. And you'll see me elaborate on a lot of these things. Now, some of these may be somewhat controversial. I certainly welcome people's comments and questions about them. I do want to preface, before I go into some of these topics, that I try to be, as much as I can, apolitical. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you've heard some of my podcasts before, where I talk a little bit about politically related topics, one of the things that you'll hear is that I'm pretty much of an independent. So when I vote, I try to vote for the best candidate or the least negative of the two candidates. Sometimes, unfortunately, the way our political system increasingly is going, all the choices we have are poor. But I still have to vote because whoever is in office is going to affect my life and our country. And so I try to pick the lesser of two evils when I'm faced with that dilemma. The other thing that I've consistently said is I think our political system is broken. Regardless of whether you call yourself a Democrat, a Republican, or like myself, an independent, we just have a lot of problems with our political system, and I think it's gotten much worse over the years. And unfortunately, it's strife with corruption, and unfortunately, there's more and more money that goes into controlling our electoral process. And you'll hear me elaborate on some of these key statistics and barometers today. So getting back to the title leading up to today's podcast, Grifters versus Idealist. Okay, what is a grifter? Well, the definition from a dictionary standpoint is a grifter is a con artist, someone who swindles people out of money through fraud. If there's one type of person you don't want to trust, it is a grifter. Grifters say one thing and do another. They've also been called over the years a confidence man. They kind of know what to say to get people to take a specific course of action when they have no intention, obviously, of doing what they are advertising to their potential customers. For those of you that either watch old movies or are a little bit up in the tooth like myself, we had a famous movie called The Sting that starred Robert Redford and Paul Newman. It was about two grifters who conned an organized crime mafia figure in Chicago back in the 1930s. For those of you that haven't seen that movie, you should go into the movie archives. It was a great movie. Paul Newman and Robert Redford were two of the best actors of the 20th century, and I think you'd enjoy that. Now, keep in mind what I just said about grifters, and now let's go into idealism. So I've quantified that a little bit. What is the difference between idealism and realism in politics? In order for us to be able to differentiate between idealism and realism, we first must have a thorough understanding of the two terms. Idealism is when you envision or see things in an ideal or perfect manner. Now, as we know, almost never are things perfect, but an idealist wants to get them to that point of view, and sometimes they look at things through rose-colored glasses, but there's little chance of idealism actually being accomplished. It's a noble objective, but it's not always realistic. Realism, on the other hand, tends toward a more pragmatic and actual view of a situation. So, over the course of a lot of our history, politics is governed more by a pragmatic point of view. And what I mean by that is Democrats have one perspective, Republicans have another. And they've been the two principal parties of our country for a couple hundred years now. But in order for things to get legislatively passed, both sides have to compromise to some degree, because in a perfect democratic world, 100% of their viewpoints would be agreed to. In a perfect Republican view, 100% of their viewpoints would be agreed to. But it's very infrequent that those objectives can be accomplished and still have our government running. So it takes give and take. Obviously, the party in power has more leverage, so they're going to get a higher preponderance of their objectives passed, but they still have to compromise, because there's always some people in each party that are not mainstream. They may be on the extremes, and so they also necessitate the compromise. And so that's something that is just a reality of the situation. But unfortunately, in today's political climate, we're really not facing that. And what do I mean by that? Well, for those of you that keep up at some point with the news, whether it's listening to what's on television, whether it's surveying the internet, whether it's reading newspapers, we've had, in the less than 3 months that the new administration under President Trump has been in office, we've had things happening that are hard to fathom. There's such a dramatic change from what we've experienced over the past many years that it's causing a lot of consternation, confusion, panic, worldwide concern. There's just been a lot of different things going on that are extreme. So what are some examples of that I wanted to discuss today? Well, the first and foremost thing are the tariffs. The tariffs are just starting to go into effect, and they're going to hit pretty much all segments of our economy. We'll see how long they stay in focus for, but assuming they stay in line for a long period of time, it's going to have a demonstrable effect on our whole economy and way that we do business. Most of the current forecasts of the announced tariffs, and this has nothing to do with politics, these has to do with economists and really people on all sides of the spectrum. I would say a heavy preponderance of people in today's climate are against tariffs as President Trump is implementing. There's a lot of fear and trepidation that these tariffs are going to cause two things at the same time that are typically not a good combination. And what those are it's going to significantly raise the price of goods and services in our country. At the same time, it's going to throw the country into a recession due to these price increases, and it's also going to cause inflation. So you've got prices going up substantially, and you've got business declining substantially. That is a recipe for disaster. At the same time, it's projected that we're going to increase unemployment by a significant amount. And some examples already of this are they've kind of taken what they call an axe to our governmental system. So they're just terminating people by the thousands and thousands. They're cutting funding for what a lot of people feel are necessary services. For example, that the Department of Health and Human Services has been cut dramatically. A lot of our assistance programs, both abroad and in the United States, have been cut back. Hospital funding has been cut back. There's just a lot of things. Disaster funding has been cut back. The list is really too long to really chat about. And I think regardless of your viewpoints, I think a lot of people are understandably very concerned about these things. I'll focus on the health aspect. You know, in the last pandemic, we had millions of people die from it, and I won't go into the cause and effect with that. It's sufficient to say that if funding had been cut back during that time, we probably would have even had more people die from it. And it's just a matter of time before we have other health crises on a larger scale. You know, with a lot more people against vaccines, and the new head of the Health and Human Services, Robert Kennedy, being an anti-vaxxer, we've started to see in certain parts of the country a big uptick in measles. And measles was one of the diseases that had pretty much been eradicated. But due to the extremists against vaccines and a lot of the false information, in my opinion, that's been spread, more people are not having their children vaccinated. And that would be okay if people didn't have to interact with other people. In other words, when you send your kid to public schools and there's unvaccinated kids at the public schools, God forbid somebody gets measles in that public school, there's a much greater chance of that spreading. And then, of course, it's kind of the exponential effect. One person gets it, 2 people get it, 4 people get it, 8 people get it, 16 people get it, and before you know, this thing is mushroom. Think back to COVID. When COVID came out in March or April of 2021, that was during President Trump's, 2020, that was during President Trump's last year in office. And when it was initially brought to his attention, he kind of poo-pooed it and said, oh, it's just a case of the flu and, you know, it's nothing to be concerned about. And then Within a month of that, it was a whole different story, and we rushed to get a vaccine to market. We shut down our whole economy and businesses for about 6 weeks in many of the states. It was quite scary, and a lot of people that we all know died or got very sick. I had some friends of mine that were in good health. They weren't smokers. They weren't overweight. They didn't have pre-existing conditions to any degree, and they were hospitalized. And it was feared that one of them was going to pass away, and they were both in their 40s. But fortunately, they were able to survive. One of the folks that I know had long haulers with COVID. And we still don't really know the after effects of COVID. There's a lot of projections that we won't know that for another 10 or 20 years. But nonetheless, it would have been advisable for people not to get COVID. I know myself, I got COVID twice, and I try to take every precaution I could. And I know the one side effect that I notice is I cough more. And I'm not overweight. I don't smoke. I exercise. My respiratory system is pretty good, but I cough more than I used to. And I'm sure that's a byproduct of me having COVID. So if our health department continues to get cutbacks, it just bodes, it's a very scary fact for our country. So the tax cuts we mentioned relative to tariffs. And what do I mean by tax cuts? Well, this is Marty Kaiser's theory. This is not a mainstream theory, but if all these tax cuts stay in place for a long period of time, and we derive the potential revenue that President Trump and his economic advisors are saying we're going to generate, we'll take that at face value. We'll say that they're correct in those assumptions, just with a dollars and cents point of view. The thing that's scary and interesting at the same time is that additional tariff income would only pay for the tax cuts that President Trump wants to implement. And those tax cuts are basically for the wealthy. They're not going to benefit the middle class people or the people that are lower than middle class. So think about that for a sec. We're going to go through all these headaches and trials and tribulations and changing our way of life, possibly affecting our business. Just a lot of things that I've brought up. For what reason? So that we can pay for tax cuts for the wealthy. Well, there's something intrinsically that's not right about that. And I truly feel that that's a big objective of this that's never going to be admitted to. And why do I feel that way? Well, who's running our government right now of the highest power levels? We've got a record number of billionaires that have been appointed to key government positions. So billionaires are setting the economic policy for our country. So what's common about billionaires? They love making money, nothing wrong with making money. They love having power. They love being in control. And for the most part, most billionaires do not relate to the common person. The amount of money that these billionaires control now, in a lot of people's opinion, is a lot more money than anybody could spend in 10 lifetimes. Just to give you a little statistical data on millionaires, or billionaires rather, I'm sorry. Who's the richest person in the world right now? Elon Musk. And what is Elon Musk doing now? Well, he's in charge of DOGE, who is the government agency in charge of reducing government. And he's pretty much setting the policies. He's coming in with kind of a meat cleaver just to cut away at things. Well, Elon Musk, depending on what you read, is worth somewhere between $340 and $360 billion. Think about that. And he's lost money recently because he's so unpopular that a lot of people are boycotting Tesla or doing things. But his loss of wealth, it would be like you and I, spending $100, even though it might be a lot of money relative to norms, it's not going to affect him in the slightest. Just to give you a comparison of how much more wealthy he is than anybody else, the second most wealthy person in the United States right now is worth $215 billion. That's still a ton of money, but it's about 40% less than Elon Musk is worth. So, do you really think that Elon Musk cares about the average Joe in this country? I certainly don't, and I think his behavior and inflammatory comments correlate to exactly what I'm saying. But the scary thing about this is, besides him setting policy, is his control over politics. Well, our political system, at the beginning of this, I was talking about how corrupt it is. Well, due to the Supreme Court over the years, they've kind of made giving money, there's no limits on it if you go through certain channels. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll just use Elon Musk. He's going to be my whipping boy today. Elon Musk donated to Donald Trump last year $277 million for his political campaign. That was far more than anybody's ever donated. And there's no limit on that. He's rumored this first quarter to be in a position and is interested in giving Trump and his related entities over $100 million. At the same time, in 2024, when he donated all that money to Trump, Elon Musk's net income and value went way up because he knew that Donald Trump's policies, if they were enacted, would significantly benefit Elon Musk. So it was like an investment for him. It's like if I buy a house and I'm expecting to make a profit for it, Elon Musk is basically buying political influence because he knows by donating that amount of money, he's going to personally benefit hugely. And that, to me, there's something intrinsically wrong with that. I mean, and it's scary because there doesn't seem to be any limits with that. Another thing that Elon Musk has done, which he's proud to advertise, is he's buying people's votes. He's holding lotteries in certain states. He's giving individual voters over $1 million. I mean, he's just doing things that, politics has always been somewhat of a dirty business, but he's brought it to a new high. And he's made it so that if you're not wealthy or if you don't sell your soul to people like Elon Musk, how are you going to run for higher office? It's getting increasingly hard to do that. And it's just an example of our whole political system being, upside down. We really need to blow up our political system and start from scratch. But obviously that's probably not going to happen. But these are things that you need to be aware of. And the reason that I'm bringing these up is I'm also going to transition and say, well, how do these things affect real estate? Well, there's a silver lining to this. And what is that? Well, it's projected that with these tariffs and all these policies that are going to be enacted, as I mentioned, is really going to damage the economy significantly. But the one sector that will be somewhat insulated compared to the other sectors is real estate, because a lot of these things that are going to be taking place are not going to affect significantly pre-owned real estate. And keep in mind that I said the word pre-owned real estate. Why did I say pre-owned? Well, because with new homes, the cost of a lot of housing materials, which are imported, are going to go expectedly way up. So if the cost of materials to buy new homes go way up, or to build new homes rather than go way up, the builders are going to have two options. They can either raise their prices significantly, or they can choose, in order to stay in business basically and not have to lay a lot of their workforce off, they're going to take little or no profits. Normally, corporations, as a general rule, are in business to make money. So it would be a surprise if they are philanthropic and put the needs of retaining their workforce above profits. If they're publicly traded, there's probably little chance of that happening because they have to answer to their stockholders. And the stockholders are all about what are the stocks selling for. It's expected that with these tariffs, not counting the auto industry, the average cost of goods or services is going to go up about 17%. So hypothetically, if you were out there looking at houses, let's say for $500,000 or $600,000, which nowadays for a new house is not that excessive by any means, 17% of that would be an increase of $85,000. Now, maybe it won't have a direct correlation, but even if it goes up 5 or 10%, you're looking at $25,000 to $50,000 increase on a new house. Well, that's pretty significant, and that's going to change the buying patterns of a lot of people. Pre-owned homes, fortunately, are not as sensitive to that because the main cost for a resale or a pre-owned home is just paying to sell the home. In other words, paying the normal fees that states impose on sellers, compensating your real estate agent or broker if you list it with them. You know, if you have to do repairs, hopefully they're not significant. So even if materials go up, it's not going to dramatically affect the cost of your house. And so far, the cost of pre-owned housing has relatively stayed flat for the past 6 to 12 months. So hopefully they're not going to go down significantly even in this economic downturn. The fear, of course, is that with all these changes and a recession and an inflation and the continued higher interest rates, that less people will want to buy homes. And that's certainly a possibility. The good news is that if we do get into a recession, knock on wood, interest rates will probably have to go down, because when you're in a bad economic time frame, then usually the cost of money loosens up and they lower the interest rates. The other thing the reason that I'm looking at this as maybe something a little bit more positive is, like I mentioned in my last podcast, it may be a great time to buy a house. Why is that? Well, because you're going to have a little bit more purchasing power. You're not going to have as much competition. And you can still make money, because real estate, we know, is always going to increase in value. Whereas the cost of goods or services, whether you're buying an automobile, you're buying a computer, whatever the case may be, the cost of these items in all likelihood could go up significantly. So you might as well reallocate whatever major purchase you're considering into real estate. So I'm cautiously optimistic that that may happen. Another thing, and I'm kind of transitioning a little bit, so I apologize for that, is when we take this hatchet to government programs and say the government's bloated, the government gives too much money to people. And I'm not here to argue that one way or the other, but I always find it interesting that the wealthiest people like getting corporate welfare. And what do I mean by that? Well, do you know that Elon Musk, during the course of his business career, has gotten over $38 billion worth of assistance from the U.S. government? And now Elon Musk is worth $377 billion. So here's a guy that is uber critical of the government, is trying to cut government programs off at the knees that benefit everyday people, but yet he had no problems getting $38 billion of assistance. Now, of course, probably one of his excuses are that he's advancing things. In other words, he's coming out with energy efficient, progressive vehicles, like the electric cars for Tesla, the space program that he does, and things of that nature. You also notice that with a lot of these space programs now, the wealthy people are paying to go up in space. So again, it's more of the rich feeding the rich. I think it's all very instructive when you analyze people's behaviors. And there's certainly nothing wrong with a wealthy person choosing to explore and pay to go up in space. But there's something intrinsically wrong with a billionaire piloting an experimental space program, getting government assistance, and then on some of these private space things, they charge people to go up in space. I just find that all very interesting. And so from my perspective, these are all my observation and concerns. And I do think that there's definitely a correlation between politics and real estate. And I'm hoping in the times that we're living in right now that a lot of these changes I'm mentioning don't adversely affect real estate so much. I've been in real estate for a good number of years, and I was doing a study today of politics and cyclical cycles. So the presidents that have been in office since I've been in real estate, we had George Bush Sr., we had Bill Clinton for 2 years, we had George Bush Jr. for 2 terms, we had Barack Obama for 2 terms, we're having Donald Trump for 2 terms, and we had Joe Biden for 1 term. So when you do the math on that, we've had an equal amount of Democrats and Republicans. So the problems that I'm mentioning in politics far supersede which party's in office. We have a lot of these same problems regardless of whether we have a Democrat or a Republican. Obviously, both parties have their own political views, but nonetheless, we've experienced this corruption, which has gotten worse no matter who's been in charge. We've experienced a growing separation of the classes. The gap between the wealthiest people and the poorest people is way more than it was 35 years ago. The middle class is eroding. Our kids are having more problems in terms of getting jobs that they went to college for. They're having more challenges getting into their first home. And that's why it's important that we really stay on top of this stuff and we complain about it. A lot of people I know I talk to say, I'm not watching the news, I'm not reading newspapers because the news is depressing, I have too much anxiety. I, as an individual, can't do anything about things, so I've got to live my life. And while certain of those observations are true, the flip side of that is if we take a blind eye to these things, it kind of gives the government carte blanche to do these things without opposition. And I'll leave off my last few minutes here with one interesting and important piece of data. And I want everybody to listen to this. I'm a student of history, so I like doing research. So not only when I go on a podcast, but I want to make sure that I'll tell you when things are my opinion. I'll also tell you when things are facts that I've researched. So what are the sayings that you may have learned during your studies in school? Well, history repeats itself. And that's never more true than today. If you think about when you took history in school, a lot of it was whitewashed. One thing the United States has done, sometimes in certain states worse than others, is they don't really admit to some of the real negative things that we've done. they try to whitewash it. And in fact, the latest thing in some of these states is completely eradicating things that were done to disadvantaged groups. It's almost like they didn't happen. Well, we all know it happened. And by teaching it to people, we hope that maybe people that are growing up now grow up with less biases and don't repeat what has happened. But when I say history repeats itself, okay, what do I mean by that? Well, think about the things that I'm mentioning today. The tariffs, the extreme viewpoints, the way that some of our people are being treated, the loss of rights. Well, America, by a lot of historians, was at it, what they call at its Trumpiest 100 years ago. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about 100 years ago, it was approximately in the late 19 teens, so like the 1917s to the early 1920s. And most of this took place during the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And so coincidentally, we kind of had the father of COVID during that time also, when a lot of people died. But I'm not going into the health aspect with this comparison. What I'll say a few things, and you please check my facts on this. During that time period, over 75 newspapers and magazines were shut down because they were found to be too critical, and they censored other publications. Over 1,000 Americans or more a year were imprisoned, and a lot of them for a far greater number for shorter periods for things they wrote or said. And if you think about nowadays, a lot of people are discouraged from saying things. I don't know if you've read about some people's telephones at the airport are being searched, and they've not incarcerated exactly, but they've taken people and put them in holding areas for up to a couple weeks because of things they find on their phone that they feel were negative, and they're not given the right to contact an attorney or family. The Justice Department, who you hear a lot of things about, and I won't go into what's been said other than a lot of people feel the Justice Department is going to be increasingly weaponized against people. Well, they kind of sponsored 100 years ago a nationwide vigilante group, the American Protective League. And at the time, they had about 250,000 members. And they seized, roughed up, and detained draft evaders. They violently broke up peace demonstrations, and they joined government agencies in raiding extreme or labor organizations. And all this also correlated to World War I, because World War I was a little over 100 years ago. And some of the things that happened then, they were fearful of foreign subversion. The presidential administration of Woodrow Wilson had little respect for civil liberties, and they had the worst repression in recent history. And people that spoke up against the war then, a lot of times they were incarcerated or life was made tough for them. They were called communist sympathizers. And we're starting to see the beginning of that nowadays, unfortunately, because people have to be very careful what they say now. If it sounds like it's at all threatening, then they run the risk of having some negative things occur to them. Now, just from a historical perspective, Woodrow Wilson's second term of president was from 1917 to 1921. And he was thought of at that time as a progressive idealist. So, again, you get the idealist and you get my original term, grifters versus idealist. He was determined to silence the minority of people that opposed his declaration to declare war on Germany in World War I. We had a famous political prisoner who ran for higher office called Eugene Debs. he was classified as a socialist candidate for president, and he had gotten about 6% of the vote in 1912. Just to correlate that, usually the third parties that run nowadays get anywhere from 3 to 6% of the vote. In around 1918, he gave an anti-war speech, and he was sentenced to 10 years behind bars for doing that. There was just a lot of things that took place. They came up with a federal espionage act that enabled censorship, and the changes came with amazing speed. They also made American schools stop teaching German, because German was one of the foreign languages that people took in those days. So the point of this is, people that suffer in silence, it gives the government an easier way to implement these changes that take away human rights. And at that time, there was a call for mass deportations from what were referred to as troublemakers. And even with all this going on, Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate that I mentioned, who was in prison in 1920, he received more than 900,000 votes for president while in his federal penitentiary. And the other common thing to today was the government at that time, all three branches moved in lockstep. And right now, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing all three branches, the president, Congress, and Senate is running in lockstep. And the people that are opposed to this now, to some of the policies, they're scared to say anything because they might be primaried. So unfortunately, we have very few people in politics, especially in the Republican side, that are speaking out. So they're implicitly endorsing what we're seeing in the country, even though they don't agree with it. And last but not least, Jeff Bezos, who you've probably heard of, he's actually considered more of a liberal democratic person. Among his other holdings besides Amazon, he owns the Washington Post. Well, he's kind of censored a lot of his editorial staff. They really have to come out with a libertarian perspective, and they're not allowed to come out with opinions that are contrary to what's going on in the country. And why is he doing that? Well, it's for economic reasons. Because if you noticed at the inauguration, all the high-tech people, regardless of what their political affiliations were in the first row, and these are all billionaires. And the main reason they're all there is not so much that they all agree on everything, but they know that technology is where all the money is at. So they want to try to work in lockstep with the government to give them the greatest ability to continue to increase their income. So these things eventually died off, but it didn't really die off. These things lasted probably a good 6 to 10 years. So it was really kind of scary. I recommend that you read up on some of these things that took place like in 1917 to 1925. And it's very enlightening. There's a lot more that I could go into, and I've probably run over my time on this podcast, so I apologize in advance. But I thought it was important for me to bring some of these things up. Like I said, I'm cautiously optimistic about real estate, but I think there's things that people need to be aware of. You need to speak up, let your local officials know how you feel about this, and stay abreast of these. That's all for today. Have a great weekend. Enjoy our weather. This is Marty Kaiser out.